Hello and welcome to Heartlight Vedic Astrology. In today's talk I was going to discuss the planetary transits or Gochara from a Vedic Astrology or Jyotish perspective for June of 2023. And it seems like kind of the theme for the month is balancing through adversity. A note, as always, before we get started, the information presented here is for educational purposes only and should not be considered medical, financial, professional, or life advice of any kind. If you are in need, please contact an appropriate professional for support. And then you can take a minute or two to read the rest of this disclaimer. So let's start out with the dates, and then we'll go through what all this means and some charts to demonstrate kind of the embodiment of these energies that are going on. So June 2nd, that's today, Venus enters Pushya nakshatra. Tomorrow, June 3rd, there's going to be a full moon in Scorpio or Vrishika nakshatra, the Rashi, and Jyestha nakshatra. Nakshatras are lunar mansions. Also, I have a double asterisk next to the moon, and whenever you see a double asterisk in my talks, like this is a transit video, I'm also creating teaching videos on Vedic astrology, and all those teaching videos can be found in my concepts playlist. So if you see a double asterisk in my talks, that means there's a teaching video available on that topic. So I do have, for example, with the moon, I have a whole video on symbolism of the moon. So if you're interested, you can check that out. The day after, June 4th, Mercury enters Krittika nakshatra. June 7th, Mercury then enters Taurus or Vrishabha Rashi constellation. June 8th, Mars enters Ashlesha nakshatra. And the same day, Sun enters Mrigashirsha nakshatra. June 13th, Mercury enters Rohini nakshatra. June 15th, Sun enters Gemini or Mithuna. June 17th, Venus enters Ashlesha nakshatra. There's also going to be, Saturn is also going retrograde that day, or Vakri. Then June 18th, there's going to be a new moon in Mrigashirsha, and Mercury goes combust that day, or asta. June 20th, Mercury enters Mrigashirsha nakshatra. And June 21st, summer solstice, Jupiter enters Bharani nakshatra. The next day, June 22nd, Sun enters Ardra nakshatra. June 24th, Mercury enters Gemini or Mithuna. June 26th, Ketu enters Chitra nakshatra. And June 27th, Mercury enters Ardra nakshatra. And then June 30th, Mars enters Leo or Simha Rashi constellation. So it's, this month it seems like every couple days or so we're going to have a shift in the planetary energies. Sometimes we get them all coming in the same week, month to month. So it looks like every few days we're going to see some kind of shift. All right, so let's talk about Venus, Shukra, and Mars, Mongol transits first, because we're going to be doing a little bit of a dance, which I mentioned partially last month. So as I mentioned, June 2nd, Venus enters Pushya nakshatra. And the other thing is that Venus in Pushya nakshatra means that Venus is in Cancer, where Mars is located. And Mars is debilitated in Cancer. So Mars is not acting, what we would say as well as it could. Mars is already a bit of a compulsive, a bit erratic. And so when it gets into its debilitation, it's going to act even more so. But the thing is, with Venus and Mars together, they're actually mutually neutral to each other. So the planets are neutral to each other. But Venus is in Cancer. Cancer is ruled by the moon. And, that's going to be, the moon is actually an enemy of Venus. So Venus isn't, being in an enemy sign is not as potent or wayward, of a position as being debilitated. That's considered a much stronger weakness. But Venus isn't acting its best either. So But the nice thing about Pushya nakshatra though is it's really lovely, gentle, nurturing nakshatra. So that's good. And so what you would expect with Venus represents things like love, art, vehicles. So if Venus is in Pushya, you would expect things like love in the form of support and nurturance. Yeah. Art in the form of public, especially because this is Cancer. Cancers are ruled by the moon, and moon represents things like the public. You would expect things like art in the form of public inspirational work. Like I have a photo here of this mural. This mural I took when I took a trip to Nicaragua. It's a small town called Esteli. And what's amazing about this town, I thought was very interesting and unique, was that they have a program where I think it's every Saturday in some public space, there's this nonprofit art group that comes and brings like paper and art supplies and things like that. And any child, can come in, even if they're homeless or something, can come in and create art. And some of the kids who keep coming to the program, they actually end up working on murals throughout the city. And so it's really fascinating because almost every building, every street corner has these fantastic murals like this. So the whole town has hundreds of murals, all done by kids who've kind of grown up through this public art, program. So, things like that. I mean, that's very much like a Venus and Pushya Cancer type energy. And again, Venus represents vehicles. So, if we're talking about, combining Venus with support, nurturance, and that sort of thing, it might be something like vehicles that are subsidized to shuttle senior citizens around, that sort of thing. It's just like a nice do-good type thing. A few days later, June 8th, Mars enters Ashlesha nakshatra. So up until the 8th, Mars is also in Pushya. So Mars is going to be acting in more of a nurturing, supportive way. But then, the energy is going to shift because the energy of Pushya is very dramatically different than Ashlesha. Ashlesha is symbolized by a snake. And so you can get snake-like energy, hissing and biting and running off into a cave, that sort of thing. It can also symbolize medicine in its best configurations. But again, Mars is debilitated here in Cancer. And Ashlesha does have a bite or sting to it, literally. So when you get Mars that's got this sort of, unexpected, potentially violent, energy on its own as a planet mixed with Ashlesha, that can make for a very potent bite or sting. Mars also represents enemies, so we've got that going on, and we can, stir that into the mix. Mars also represents siblings, so, you can take that into account. Cancer is a friendly sign for Mars, but Mars is debilitated there as well. So it's mostly weakened by being in Cancer. The thing, though, is that any planet that's debilitated, and again, I have the double asterisk, so I have a whole video on debilitation, planetary debilitation, if you're interested in learning about that in detail. The sign opposite to the Rashi or constellation of debilitation is the Rashi or constellation where the planet is exalted. So even though the eyes, usually our eyes kind of get caught by where you see the planets, but you also have to consider like the other houses that the planets aspect. So while Mars may be stirring, things up, potentially in a negative way, in Cancer, there's actually going to be strength in that same Mars in Capricorn. So, you have to look at both Rashis or constellations in a birth chart. But again, Ashlesha represents a snake or symbolized by a snake. So we've got, energies like being deceptive and being disruptive and also mesmerizing. Because snakes, especially like those hooded snakes that kind of, they kind of, the cobras and stuff, right? They kind of come up and they kind of weave back and forth, and the tongue is slithering in and out of its mouth, and you're sort of just, locked in with its eyes. People who have important placements in Ashlesha can be mesmerizing. Like I think I mentioned, what was it, last month? I tend to find people who are like stage celebrities, like actors, actresses, models, that sort of thing, like visually, especially visually mesmerizing. They tend to have, a lot of them have placements in Ashlesha. So, it works for them. They make it work for them, right? I mean, they get all eyes on them. So, they make it work. So a person, and Mars also represents libido. So with Mars and Ashlesha, we're looking at somebody, if this is a person, somebody who can be sexy, seductive, but also potentially violent, unstable. Mars also represents chemicals, and Ashlesha again can represent, medicine. But when you get chemicals, medicine, and kind of a negative twist to it, you might actually get somebody who, on the good side of things, for more positive side of things, would be a druggist or pharmacist, and on the more negative side would be somebody who's like a drug user or dealer or something like that. And again, Mars also can represent things like, when it's in a negative position or negatively conditioned, we would say, it can represent things like being a thief. So, if there's this deceptive, disruptive quality, this might be somebody who's manipulative or a liar or a thief, that sort of thing. So you can see that June 8th, through pretty much the end of the month, Mars is not going to be in a prime position for many things. And it's there with Venus. So, Venus is desire, and Mars is lust. So, there is going to be this, with these two in the same sign or constellation, there is a bit of a love story here. But the thing is, with Mars entering Ashlesha, even though it might be all lovey-dovey from June 2nd to June 8th, Mars is going to take a turn June 8th. And then Venus is going to enter Ashlesha on June 17th. So even though Venus will being in that same sign is going to help smooth, to some extent, the rough edges, once Venus enters Ashlesha as well, it's just the nature of that nakshatra is probably going to bring out more the negative side of things. I mean, again, it's just completely 180 juxtaposed to Pushya nakshatra, the energy there. So, on June 17th, we now have 2 planets in Ashlesha. So there can be this kind of like seductive, potentially manipulative because of Mars, but like a person that kind of like wraps themselves around you, even like psychologically. The way that snakes kind of invoke fear and stuff like that. A lot of people have, fears of snakes, are afraid of snakes. So Venus, again, if we're talking about people and art and like cars or something like that in Ashlesha instead of Pushya, this is somebody who's going to be, again, seductive, manipulative, somebody who kind of wraps themselves around you and won't let go. And then art, we're talking something that's going to be more provocative and more kind of shocking, it's got some shock value to it. If it's a car, it's going to be something more sporty and popular that catches looks, like maybe a Ferrari or some race car or something like that. Especially if it's just on, something in the mall parking lot that's obviously, kind of showy and, that sort of thing. So you got to be a bit careful, which again I mentioned last month. I kind of gave people the heads up about this situation here. With Venus and Mars both being in Ashlesha, especially the last couple weeks of, last 10 days of June or so. It could, on the better side of things, it could be sort of like 2 snakes entwined with each other, and actually, actually having, it's a sexy nakshatra, so it could be actually like having sex or sexy time with somebody. But just the nature of Ashlesha, I mean, this could be like who is that couple in the news recently? Megan Fox and Machine Gun Kelly. For some reason, they're coming to mind. I don't know, every day. I don't even really follow them or whatever, but they're always in the news. Like, I see their picture in the headlines and stuff, and it's like, oh, on again, off again. Oh, this is my soulmate, blah, blah. Like, just a lot of drama. So, that could be Mars and Venus in Ashlesha. And they're both, they, portray themselves as part of their persona as being kind of cool and sexy, But, they probably, go at each other. I mean, physically, it might be pretty intense sexually, but also, that back and forth mind games thing is probably at play as well. I'm guessing, but I don't know. I should probably look them up and probably one or two of both of them maybe have placements in Ashlesha. It wouldn't be surprising. So that's going on, and then June 30th, Mars enters Leo or Simha nakshatra constellation. So it's shifting into Leo, and then it's going to be in Maga nakshatra. So Mars, Leo, it's ruled by the Sun. The Sun is friendly to Mars, so Mars is definitely going to be, improving its behavior here. But the Sun, Mars, those are the two what we call Kshatriya planets. They symbolize things like leadership. So with Mars entering Leo, now we're talking about, leadership, like something like a CEO or military person, that sort of thing. And Maga Nakshatra, that gives when I see Maga in people's charts, I typically find somebody who, one, the symbol of Maga is a throne. So again, we're talking about leadership. But also the star of where Maga lies is the star that's traditionally seen as the star where our ancestors reside once they've passed over. And so there's also this energy of like ancestors and tradition and stuff like that. So when I see Maga in people's charts, I typically find somebody who is still very traditional in some sense, like maybe they're deeply Catholic, or maybe they've moved to another country, but they still maintain the lifestyle of their home country, that sort of thing. So, and I think there's some nobility, I would say, in this nakshatra. So this is like, again, quite a different, energy than Ashlesha. So again, be careful in June, because again, also, I think I mentioned last time, when you have Venus and Mars together in any constellation, not just Cancer or in Ashlesha, specific nakshatra, usually we would find that person has what we call a love-marriage combination in their chart. And so when we see a love marriage, Venus and Mars together in somebody's chart, it's sort of like all bets are off. Like, those folks don't tend to seek traditional, not traditional, but traditional in terms of if somebody would come to a Jyotishi, a Vedic astrologer, asking for like birth chart matching before marriage, an arranged marriage in India, for example, which is a lot of what Jyotish was used for. Part of that process of assessing the compatibility charts are very practical things like, is this person stable? Are they going to, bring in an income? Or are they going to reproduce, and have kids? Because that's very important in, traditional Indian culture. Are they going to, be intact? Are they going to remain alive? Like very practical things, because, if you don't have kids, or if you're widowed, or, that sort of thing, like those are very difficult circumstances in traditional Indian society. But somebody who's got a Venus-Mars combination, a love-marriage combination, even if two charts don't look great, and Jyotishi, based on these traditional values, would say this isn't a good match, somebody who has a Venus-Mars combination probably wouldn't listen. Like, that's the person, like in the Bollywood movies, like that's the person, that would like run off and elope, potentially, or just, shun the advised candidate, marriage candidate by their parents or family or something like that. Because they're looking for more emotional connection and more, excitement and that sort of thing, which isn't the most practical thing, So anyway, there might be somebody, exciting and sexy who shows up, but just, watch out for yourself. Keep your wits about you, let's say, during June here. So here's a couple of charts. I'll keep it a mystery for a few moments here. But the first chart I brought up, because this person actually has Mars in Ashlesha. You can see Mars is in the chart on the left. Mars is in the 6th house in Cancer. That little 4 there represents the 4th constellation of the zodiac, which is Cancer. And it's in the last couple degrees of Cancer. So that's going to be the last nakshatra, or Ashlesha nakshatra of Cancer. So let's just go through this chart, and we'll start comparing it to the other chart. And even though, so I also circled on both of these the moon position. In the first chart, it's at 29 degrees 13, and then the second one is 1 degrees 15. So it's within a degree, and because the moon moves so fast, it's possible that the moon, like in the first chart, the moon is actually in Pisces. That's a possibility. Although, knowing who this person is, I think it's more likely it's an Aquarius chandra lagna, at least. And also for both these people, I didn't have an exact birth time. So, it's just sort of like, what information can we get? Just even on a very, a few things, you can probably start to figure out, who these people are. And then the second chart, moon, is actually, I think for this person, most likely in Taurus. Although there is a possibility that the moon is also, could be in Aries. So just note that, But still, even with all that said, there's still things we can get from these charts. So again, the first chart on the left, it's Aquarius or Kumbha Chandra Lagna. And the moon is in Uttara Bhadrapada. And Aquarius is an air sign. So this is somebody who's going to be mostly living in the world of ideas. Air represents things like ideas, thoughts, philosophies, that sort of thing. As an Aquarius Chandra Lagna, it is ruled by Saturn. And Saturn is in Mula. Mula is another pretty heavy-duty nakshatra. Mula, the deity of Mula is Kali, who's like this very fierce goddess of destruction. And Mula the symbol of that is a bunch of roots tied together. So there's depth and darkness and destruction associated with that nakshatra. And Saturn represents things like death and decay, slowness, obstacles, that sort of thing. So, in a good way though, the Lagna, or the ruling planet of this chart, Saturn, has gone to the 11th house, and it aspects back into the lagna, which actually gives it strength. So that's going to really fortify this person. The other thing to note is that this person isn't born into Sadhisati. Sadhisati is about a 7.5 year period where Saturn crosses the constellation before, of, and after where the natal moon is placed, and it's usually a very difficult period for many people. Not that it's always all bad, but it can be a very difficult period. The only thing that's sort of common for everybody is that they typically lose support systems, important support systems in their life, which can, again, there's a lot of reconstruction that happens in somebody's life when they go through Sadhisati. So this person wasn't born into Sadhisati, but within a couple of years or so, this person will be in Sadhisati. So that means basically the first 10 years of their life or so, there's a lot of hardship, I would say, difficult times. And typically, when somebody is born into Sadhisati or born just before Sadhisati, that really kind of colors somebody's point of view for the rest of their life. If the first 10 years of their life are difficult, then, it changes their even expectations of themselves and other people, life, that sort of thing. And then this Mars in Ashlesha is also aspecting into the lagna. So we have Mars and Saturn aspecting the lagna. So what would a Mars-Saturn combination give? It often gives, I see in people's charts, like sports, like people tend to be athletes, because Mars is all about fire, initiation, and that sort of thing, and Saturn is a planet of perseverance. So it's somebody who's like a workaholic. That can also be a workaholic, but like somebody who has usually some aspect of their life where they're pretty intense about what they're doing, and they just kind of do and redo and redo. I mean, they're kind of a machine about it. It can also represent things like engineering. So, since the Mars and Saturn are aspecting into the Chandra lagna, this is somebody who's going to be a person of ideas and possibly sports, possibly engineering. Someone who's like, and the thing is, any planets in the lagna are going to reflect into the whole chart. So they're going to have that kind of way about them, that sort of like workaholic, engineering, sporty, potentially type, in almost every aspect of their life. And I also circled here Rahu, Mercury, Jupiter. So Jupiter can represent things like philosophy. Mercury can represent, and Jupiter can also represent teaching. Mercury can represent ideas, decisions, games, communication, but in decision making. And the Rahu always kind of adds a twist to things. So this is somebody who's thinking a lot, possibly talking a lot, but thinking kind of, is innovative or has unusual decisions and philosophies. But that is most likely successful because Mercury and Rahu are on Anuradha nakshatra. Anuradha is symbolized by a victory gate, but it's different from Vishaka, which is the nakshatra before it. Vishaka nakshatra is also symbolized by a victory gate, but when people have placements in Vishaka, they typically are kind of win at all cost type people, and so they end up burning bridges, ruining relationships, or there's collateral damage that happens. People who have placements in Anuradha, they tend to be bridge builders, and they bring people together. So there is strength in this chart because Saturn aspects the lagna and aspects its own sign. But this person is somebody who's going to have a lot of, I would say at least mental troubles, burdens, because Saturn and Mars are both in difficult nakshatras. And so there's going to be some disruptions and things like that. But I think ultimately, especially since this Jupiter-Mercury-Rahu combination is in the 10th house of career and fame, they're going to be successful. So now let's contrast that with the chart on the right here. So in this chart, it's a Taurus lagna this time, or Vrishabha lagna, Chandra lagna again. And the moon is in Krittika. So the energy of that nakshatra is somebody, it's kind of a dual nakshatra. There's a fierce warrior energy to it, but there's also a nurturing foster mother energy to it. So it kind of can flip, It's also an earth sign. So this person is going to be, whereas the air sign person is going to be more about ideas and philosophies and things like that. The earth sign person is going to be much more pragmatic. And actually both of them are fixed signs, so they're both going to be fairly stable and have this stick-to-itiveness. But let's continue on here. So this chart is ruled by Venus. Venus is exalted in Revati. That's a very lovely placement for Venus. And Venus has also gone to the 11th house. So the 11th house represents things like clubs, groups, societies, income, risk-taking, that sort of thing. So what's interesting is both lagnashas here have gone to the 11th house, but one has Saturn and Mula, and the other one has Mercury, Venus, and Sun. So one of these people is probably asocial, right? The chart on the left, and the chart on the right, this person's all about networking and enjoying themselves and that sort of thing. So again, similarities, but in some ways completely different. The other thing about Venus, even though there's some strength because it's exalted, it's also combust because it's so close to the sun, and it's in planetary war with Mercury. So it's actually hidden and destabilized. And with it being in planetary war with Mercury, it means that the things related to Mercury, such as business and games and communication, are going to be at war with the things that Venus represents, which are things like social grace and art. So and the houses that are ruled by Mercury and Venus are also going to be unstable or less stable because of this planetary war situation. So what's interesting is that this chart, Mars is also aspecting the lagna. Mars is in Shatabhisha. Shatabhisha, it's translated as 100 healers. So there can be difficult diseases that are difficult to cure. With somebody with placements in Shatabhisha, they can also be a doctor. They can also be a healer. So you have to kind of look at that, which way it might go. And Saturn is also, again, aspecting the lagna. So, so Mars and Saturn both aspecting the lagna in both charts. Saturn is in Jyestha. Jyestha is symbolized by a talisman. So typically people with Saturn are either sort of protective type people, like police, military, that sort of thing, or it can be a talisman, almost like a shamanic type, like where they wear the talisman for protection, for spiritual protection. So this person also has this like sporting engineering potential vibe to them. But again, we already know that this person is much more social. Yeah, so that's a big difference. And practical as opposed to theoretical. There's also a parivartana, or exchange of houses between Mars and Saturn, so you can actually flip Mars and Saturn, and then the thing is, I was kind of with that kind of situation with the parivartana between Mars and Saturn, it always kind of kind of is a little bit of a red flag. Just because Saturn and Mars can potentially create havoc, they're considered malevolent, malefic planets. And when they both, most of the planets only have one aspect where they only aspect the house across from them. They shine their light into the house across from them. But Saturn and Mars actually have special aspects. So Mars aspects 3, 7, and 10 houses away, and Mars aspects 4, 7, and 8 houses away. So when you do the flip, what that means is that, like I counted up, like Saturn and Mars, and again we have Mars in, what did I say? Shatabhisha, and Saturn and Jyestha, which are, again, not easy nakshatras. They aspect into 6 houses each. So most of the chart, this is going to be a very heavily Mars and Saturn influence chart, more than you would expect until you start looking at the parivartanas and stuff like that. There's also a parivartana between Jupiter and Mercury. Even though Mercury is debilitated here, there is a Nichabanga, and Nichabanga is sort of a break in planetary debilitation. I actually have a video on that as well. Venus being there, because Venus is the planet that's exalted, and the sign that Mercury is debilitated in helps a bit. But also this Parivartan helps. So Mercury goes, you can flip Mercury into the 5th house, Jupiter back in the 11th house. So now you've got Swa Mercury, so Mercury in its own house, Jupiter retrograde in its own house. So that Jupiter is expansive. It's going to expand even more this drive in the 11th house to socialize, to network, and also drive for income. And then the Mercury in Virgo, usually when somebody has a very strong Mercury, like retrograde in its own house, like either Gemini or Virgo, those people tend to they have a strong inclination to be entrepreneurs. So we're getting more clues here. So, and then also Mercury and Jupiter are planets that represent communication. So the person on the right here is socializing, much more communicating, much more, and we're seeing strength here, right? Because with the 2 Parivartanas, you now potentially have 4 planets that are in their own signs. So there's a lot of strength here. And what else? Let's see. Jupiter is in Hasta nakshatra, so that's represented by the hand. So that's another indication this person is very practical, pragmatic, And so again, with the Jupiter and Mercury both being in their own signs, there's going to be, this person's, and especially in the 5th house and in the 11th house, this whole 5-11 axis here, the 5th house is about advising and teaching, and then the networking. So this is somebody who advises, teaches, talks a lot. So you can see these 2 folks are quite a bit different. And who are these people? Well, they happen to be brothers. So the chart on the left is Adolf Dassler, and the chart on the right is his older brother Rudolph Dassler. So if you've never heard of them, Adolf Dassler they used to call him Adi for short. So if you do Adi and then instead of Adi Dassler, Adi Das, he is actually the founder of Adidas footwear, athletic footwear company. And his brother, Rudolph Dassler, was the founder of Puma, so the competing company of Puma athletic shoe wear. And so these brothers, so it's kind of interesting in Adi's chart, you see this, getting back to this Mars and Ashlesha. So again, this is a kind of a long-winded story of giving you some context or embodiment for this Mars and Ashlesha energy. So Mars is here in the 6th house of enemies. It is the planet that represents enemies. It's debilitated. And it's also in Ashlesha. So, I don't know a whole lot about the history between these 2. I did see a movie. There's a movie on, I think, Amazon if you're interested. And it was a pretty vicious fallout at some point between these 2 brothers. Like, they started up their shoe company together, and the thing is, Adi was the engineer inventor. He was the one who was constantly like upgrading and reinventing the shoes and that sort of thing. And then, but they weren't really selling. And then Rudolph, the older brother, was the salesperson. So he was the one taking the shoes out in the community, right? Networking, clubs, groups, societies, and he was getting the shoes to like sports teams and stuff like that, and getting them famous and kind of publicizing it. And then at some point, they had a falling out, massive falling out. They told their employees, like, you can stick with one or the other of us, but we're splitting up. And I think most of the employees stayed with Adi, and then a third of them went off with Rudolph. But like, I think it's something like literally two competing shoe companies I think it's like even across the river from each other. And it came to the point where even their employees don't socialize with each other. There's like that level of enmity. Like the bars in town, they were either the Adidas bars or the Puma bars or something like that, because the employees won't like associate with each other. I mean, pretty deep, and I don't know if it's still going on to this day, but you never know. Um, but yeah, so, but it's, again, even with limited information for some of these charts, because again, I don't have exact birth times, and because both of their moons were, Sunday, actually, within a degree of the Rashi change or constellation change, there was a potential for the moon to be elsewhere than where I've placed it, but I'm guessing this is probably where the moon is. But I don't know the rising sign. I don't know the Jaya lagna. But still, you can get some vibe, some initial indications of who somebody is and what their strengths are and that sort of thing. So yeah, at least in the movie, they were quite a bit. They were portraying Rudolph, which I don't know if it's true or not. I don't know how much artistic license the film makers took, but they were portraying Adi, the inventor brother, as being like, very optimistic and kind of dreamy and just, obsessed about making shoes. And, but, in his workshop, away from people, just like, literally hammering these shoes out. And Rudolph was the schmoozer, kind of sales guy, who was a Flander as well, at least in the movie. So again, that's the Mercury-Venus planetary war there. So even though Rudolph has a lot of strength, there's also a lot of instability. So I'm guessing that Rudolph, especially because of the Anuradha placements in Adi's chart, I'm guessing Rudolph made a lot more enemies. But, in Adi's chart here, basically his brother, so Mars represents enemies, it represents siblings, it's, massively debilitated in Ashlesha, the house of enemies, aspecting into the 12th house the 6th house is obvious, kind of overt enemies, and the 12th house is hidden enemies. So he's got Mars on either, on both. And they both, with the Saturn and Mars on the moon, they both had a lot of things in their mind, but in their mind they were also athletes and engineers. So they kept pushing through all the adversity that came through. Because again, these companies came up like through, the Second World War, and they were almost decommissioned by the military, or they had to start producing, boots or something for the military and that sort of thing, just to survive, to get through that time period. And then Rudolph was, I think, conscripted, so he was off, and then that was more of him getting upset with Adi because he felt like Adi didn't do enough to prevent that. Anyway, so there's a long, deep history there of fraternal discord. But again, this is all embodying the energies, the planetary energies. I do have their birth data on the next slide, so if you're interested in that. So that was Mars and a lot of Venus and a lot of Mars. So then what else is going on? So moon transits, or chandra, in June 3rd, there's going to be full moon in Scorpio, Vrishika, Rashi, constellation in Jyestha nakshatra. The moon being in Scorpio is debilitated, so we have a lot of debilitation here. And the symbol, as I mentioned, of Jyestha nakshatra is a talisman. And because it's Scorpio is the Rashi constellation of the natural 8th house, so this is typically a constellation that involves things like deep secrets and feelings, but with the full moon, all that light of the moon, it's sort of like there's light that's brought to deep secrets and feelings and things like that. There is also a possibility, though, of being kind of two-faced or hypocritical, but also someone who's older, senior, when there are placements in specifically Jyestha. And Scorpio, again, the symbol of Scorpio is a scorpion. So we got more of these stinging, biting, animals. It's going to be a little tricky in June. Not entirely easy breezy here. And as I mentioned, because of that talisman symbol, you can think of protection like power, like almost like power and police, but also the occult and intuitive and shaman type energies. It can kind of go in two different directions there. All right, so there should be some, I think probably potentially big epiphanies for some people with this full moon on the 3rd. A couple weeks later, June 18th, there's going to be a new moon in Gemini, Mithuna, Mrigashirsha nakshatra. So the moon in Gemini, Mercury is friendly to the moon. Mercury owns Gemini, so, the moon's fairly happy there. There's some support. The symbol of Mrigashirsha is a deer's head. So deer in a lot of cultures, not just like, Vedic tradition, the Vedic tradition, is kind of this animal that like wanders through the forest. So so nakshatra placements in Mrigashirsha nakshatra, for example, tend to have this energy of seeking, searching, and like, it could be something like researching, or it could be spiritual seeking or something like that. So with the new moon, that's a time, new moons are times of planting new seeds and kind of cultivating the previous harvest and sowing new seeds. So, and Gemini is an air sign, it's a dual sign, so, again, a lot of ideas, thoughts, that sort of thing. So I could see, especially with the moon representing psychology, I could see somebody, with this placement, or during this new moon on June 18th, somebody could be really motivated to start therapy, because they're seeking answers within themselves, or starting meditation, a meditation practice, potentially doing some research. These are the things that might kind of come up with this new moon on the 18th. And the research, though, might be something, and this meditation therapy, this kind of reflective period, might actually have to do with relationship or sexual problems, and I'll get into why. I'll show you the chart on the next slide. And problems involving the communication, possibly libido and daily routine. So let me show you the chart, and then it'll make more sense why I wrote all this stuff down. So this is a chart for the new moon in Gemini. This is 18th of June, 36 minutes into the morning, Eastern Standard Time. So in this chart, we have a massively strong lagna here. You can see it's an Aquarius lagna. Saturn's retrograde in that sign, so there's going to be a lot of strength to this. Let's see. So this person, usually when somebody has a strong lagna like this, they tend to be very strong and resilient. So even if they come up against obstacles, they tend to overcome them, or kind of power through them. It's an air sign, as I mentioned, like in Adolf Dassler's chart. So, but the thing is, with this much Saturn, Saturn is a planet that represents Vata. Vata is, in Ayurveda, traditional Indian medicine, like it's kind of considered a windy type energy. So when we see that, it can physically represent things that are kind of constantly changing or dry. But of the mind, it can indicate a lot of anxiety. So even though this person may be strong, there might actually be a lot of anxiety for this person, especially because Saturn is going to be in Shatabhisha, which again is 100 healers, so there can be issues there. Let's see. So, and that Saturn aspects into the 7th house. It also aspects into the 10th house. And it aspects into the 3rd house. I don't know. Let me get back to that. I'm not exactly sure why I drew all those arrows. I might have written notes later on that'll it'll come back to me, like why. That's important. Why the Saturn and all those blue arrows are important. Let me get back to that. So and then looky here. We have Mars again in the 6th house of Cancer, and specifically Ashlesha. So, and I believe Venus is also in Ashlesha. I have to double check on that. But, so this is that time period when, as I was talking about Venus and Mars on one of the previous slides, you know, this could be, and it's in the 6th house of acute disease. So this could be, you know, kind of an acute time of trouble for this couple here. Yeah, and they're trying to work things out. But they're having difficulty because, again, they're both in Ashlesha, so they're both a little sneaky. They're kind of dancing around each other or like hissing at each other or something like that. And it can be. And then also like the moon, which rules that Cancer constellation in the 6th house, it's gone to the 5th house of counseling. And that's where it's, you know, new, becoming new, where it's in the exact degree of the sun in Gemini. So again, you know, and it's in Mrigashirsha. So it's, again, it's about counseling, new ideas, psychology, purpose. Like, so I can see, like, in this kind of chart where there's again, problems potentially with libido that's causing problems, or sexual tension, communication, that, you know, somebody might be motivated to start looking for answers, you know, either with a counselor or some other alternative. If this chart was a person, the Dasha sequence goes Mars, Rahu, Jupiter, Saturn for this person. That's up until about 53 years of age, if this was a person. We do also have this Rahu and Jupiter in Ashwini. So again, Ashwini represents things like pioneering energy, but also Ashwini, it's the Kumara brothers who are the celestial physicians. So we've got Ashlesha, we got 2 planets in Ashlesha, right, which can indicate things that are medical. And we've got 2 planets in Ashwini, which is, again, another nakshatra that represents medical things. And then we have Saturn in Shatabhisha, which is it. So we have 5 planets in nakshatras that represent medicine of some kind. So if this was a person, I would really start to think that this person might end up being some sort of healthcare provider down the line. And so because of this Dasha sequence, the planets that are going to be most influential, especially in the early years, we're going to have, so that Mars in Ashlesha is going to start off. So this might actually be somebody who, especially in the first few years of life, had some sort of trauma or accident, you know, early on, because again, the 6th house represents acute illnesses, accidents, that sort of thing. And then it switches to Rahu, and then Jupiter and Saturn. So Rahu, so that yellow circle with Rahu and Jupiter, and then Saturn aspecting onto it. Basically, after the first, you know, few, maybe 10 years of life, this person is going to be all about 3rd house things. So what are 3rd house things? So things like communication, things like medically, you know, because there are all these medical nakshatras, things like hearing, things like coordination, that sort of thing. Saturn can represent things like neuromuscular disorders. Rahu can represent things like unusual diseases, rare diseases, but also devices like technology. And Jupiter can represent things like speech. So, and because Saturn aspects here, and Saturn is debilitated there, it can also indicate like unusual structures, unusual technologies, and things like that, related to things like hearing and speech. The other thing is, I think, is that why I put the arrows there? Oh, and then also, yeah, that kind of like the Dassler brothers, if this was a person, Mars would aspect into lagna. So again, you have that Mars-Saturn combination. So that's somebody who's athletic, potentially, but also an engineer, right? Getting back to that sort of thing. So let's get back to my notes and make sure I'm like on track here. So yeah, this is going to be a 3rd house person primarily. Because again, this is all these they're running the Dasha sequence of the planets up until they're 53, so that's most of their working years. Also, Mercury aspects, there's that green arrow, aspects into the 10th house. Saturn aspects into the 10th house as well. Saturn again represents things like neuromuscular issues, and Mercury represents things like hearing, but also peripheral nerves and coordination. And then also Mercury represents things, because it's the Lord of the 8th house, it represents things like research and deep psychology. So, if you start putting these pieces together, you might come up with something like there's an accident, potentially infection, or a traumatic brain injury even, because Mars aspect in the first house represents the head. It could have occurred early in childhood, influencing some sort of neuromuscular coordination. Because of the third house, heavy energy there. This could be somebody who has something like a speech disorder, like something like a lisp, or maybe even Tourette's. They have problems with their hearing or their right arm, which, even though it's the left side of the chart, there's actually a little bit of a flip, like a lot of, not every organ or body part, but there is a bit of a flip in term for some body parts of the right side of the chart represents the left side of the body, and the left side of the chart represents the right side of the body. So this would actually be, especially things, if there was a problem, something with the right arm. So I could see with also this Mrigashirsha energy and the moon and the sun, so the person's thoughts, feelings, and also purpose, career is involved in research. And Mercury, again, being the Lord of the 8th house of research, I could guess maybe that this person would, again, if this was a person, might become like a clinical or a research neurologist, because there's so many, all the neurology planets are involved here. A speech pathologist or even like an audiologist could manifest out of this chart. Also, the 9th house, which represents authority, government, is ruled by Venus. And the 10th house is ruled by Mars, and you have Venus and Mars together. So people who typically have 9th and 10th lords together can end up doing work that's related to the government. They might be like a government subcontractor, or they might do something like get government funding, such as research grants. So again, this would potentially be another layer of understanding, what this person is about and how they go about things. So this could definitely be somebody who, again, gets research grants to do research on, again, maybe new devices for hearing, or new technologies, or something for speech disorders, or maybe like prosthetic limbs. It could be something like that. That could happen as well. So yeah, so again, if this was a real person, and somebody has this chart out there, so we got to find them now. All right, so let's move on to Mercury or Buddha transits. June 4th, Mercury enters Krittika nakshatra. Krittika, again, is that energy of fierce warrior and foster mother. So because Mercury represents the mind and decision making, the rational mind, not the emotional mind, the rational mind and decision making. This is somebody who's probably going to flip between fighting for something and nurturing something. It can also, Krittika, the symbol of that is like a sharp instrument. So this could be somebody, when you put Mercury in Krittika, it could be something like writers, critical thinkers, or speakers. So somebody, that's going to be good for those folks, probably. June 7th, Mercury enters Taurus or Vrishabha. So it stays in Krittika nakshatra, but it changes into Taurus. So because it was in Aries, that's usually in Aries is a fire sign. There was probably, again, some initiation that happened June 4th. Like maybe somebody decides that they want to start writing something or speaking about something. But then it's like once Mercury moves into Taurus, it becomes more of a practical, grounded thing, activity, not just like a thought that they, jump on. And the thing that's nice too is that once Mercury moves into Taurus, it's out of the gaze of that Swa Saturn that's in Shatabhisha. So that, so that heavy-duty Saturn in its own sign has been casting its energy in Mercury. Mercury's been in Aries for a long time for Mercury. And so that's probably been putting a lot of drag, like mental drag on people and delaying decision-making for people. And it should also like improve energy coordination because, again, Saturn is going to be slowness, delays. So, and Mercury represents peripheral nerves and, hands and arms and things like that. So, Mercury people, like if you're a Gemini lagna or a Virgo lagna, you're probably going to feel better, more like your bouncy self after Mercury changes signs here. On June 13th, Mercury enters Rohini nakshatra. So Rohini is a very lovely, attractive, it's supposed to be like the most attractive, nakshatra. If all the nakshatras were different wives, there is some folklore there, then Rohini is the most attractive of the wives. So this could be a time when Mercury, the filter, the rational mind is sort of filtering things, is like seeing the beauty in all things and speaking eloquently and that sort of thing. June 18th, Mercury goes combust, so it's very close to the sun and it's going to disappear from vision in the sky. So you might see less outer manifestation of mercurial energies like travel and communication, but more thinking and planning. So June 20th, Mercury enters Mrigashirsha nakshatra. So, here we go. We're seeking, searching. So again, it's starting some sort of journey, gathering your things, because it's in Mrigashirsha in Taurus, which is a grounded, practical earth constellation. But then it's going to flip into Gemini, which is more ideas. So initially it's sort of like packing your bag, getting your passport ready, that sort of thing. Getting a few of the practical things together right before you start on your journey. But there's going to be this sort of, it's going to be the seeking mind, right? And also it can represent things like the student and sales and things like that. So somebody might be thinking of starting an educational program or selling something. Again, just starting to get your ducks in a row, that sort of thing. June 24th, Mercury gets into Gemini, Mithuna, its own sign. So that's going to be strong. But I tend to see when people have Mercury in their own sign, especially Gemini, they can sort of become a whirlwind because there's a lot of energy there and a lot of thinking and sometimes analysis paralysis, depending on what other planets are involved. But this is going to be a time for learning, research, speaking, sales, entrepreneurship, also nature lovers, because Mrigashirsha with the deer's head and being, deers walking through the forest. People with Mrigashirsha planets tend to love animals and nature. But even things like games, like chess and Scrabble, like games of the mind, more than physical games. Because for physical games, you probably need like a Mercury-Mars combination, because Mars is represents things like, again, athleticism, but also muscle even. And things like astrology. Because Mercury represents things like astrology. So somebody might start learning astrology. June 27th, Mercury enters Ardra nakshatra. That nakshatra is it's represented by, the symbol of that is like a storm cloud, lightning, that sort of thing. Also a teardrop, raindrop. So Mercury in Ardra can represent things like sudden insights and epiphanies, very quick thinking, very quick decision making. I mean, this is not somebody who's dawdling, with their mind. This is almost like the opposite energy with Mercury in Taurus, because there it's just grounded, practical, step by step. Here, this is somebody who's just lightning fast mentally. Also, it can be increased intuition, quick decision making, and also the same sort of psychology. There can also be, because Ardra can be represented by a teardrop, and there can be sadness associated here. This could be somebody who's processing grief. That's a possibility as well. So Mercury always travels fast. There's going to be quite a few changes for Mercury this month. So here's a celebrity chart. This chart is for Alan Turing. So let's orient ourselves. So what kind of lagna is this? His birth date is in the corner there, you can see. So this is a Taurus lagna, Vrishabha lagna, which is a fixed earth sign. So somebody who's going to be very fixed in their personality and also practical in many ways. Taurus is ruled by Venus. Venus has gone to the second house, which represents things like speech, communication, that sort of thing. And it's in Mrigashirsha, so seeking, research, that sort of thing. Venus is so close to the sun, it's actually combust. So I tend to see, not always, but I tend to see, especially people who have some almost like an autistic type bent to them, if not truly autistic. I found in looking at charts, like a lot of these folks tend to have Venus combust, so that kind of deeply sensitive and emotional, but not necessarily someone who communicates it much or well. So anyway, Saturn is in Krittika. We mentioned Krittika as being potentially critical in nature, but also a warrior and a foster mother. And Krittika, again, can represent writers. Alan Turing was a writer. Jupiter is also aspecting into the lagna. It's an Anuradha, so, kind of like Adi Dassler. This person is somebody who ends up building bridges over time and is very successful. Let's see, what else do we have here? The sun. Oh, okay, so the sun, so going back to the second house now with the Lagnesha Venus, there's also the sun and a compass Mercury in Ardra. So again, we have this notion of quick decision making, lightning fast, but also like potentially electricity is something that's important for communication. Let's see. Saturn and the lagna aspects the Mars in the third house, and Mars is in Ashlesha again. So somehow I found all these charts with Mars and Ashlesha, so that's going to be a running theme. So that's going to make them, this sort of athletic person. And again, it might be an athlete of the mind. It doesn't always have to be an athlete of the body. And you have Jupiter on this, so that's expansive. And you have Rahu on this. Rahu, you can take the aspect of Rahu because Jupiter is aspecting Rahu, and Rahu's in Jupiter's sign. So you have Saturn, Mars, Jupiter, and Rahu essentially in this third house. So this is somebody who's going to be obsessed with third house matters. So this is another third house person. And you have Saturn and Mars here, so that can be like almost like nuts and bolts type thing, like literally nuts and bolts machinery and that sort of thing. And Jupiter is about communication. Rahu is about sudden, unexpected, hidden things, technology. So Alan Turing, the third house is also the house of computers. Alan Turing was the inventor of the Turing machine, which essentially was the precursor for our modern general computer. So you can see this communication, the electricity bit, and all this already, like the second and third house are showing a lot. But also, getting back to this Mars and Ashlesha, it aspects in 4 houses away into, again, the 6th house of enemies. And so part of what he was, one of the important things he was part of, besides doing his mathematical work and writing about that, and writing about new algorithms and stuff like that, coding, and creating, the first computer essentially, was that he used all of this to help with code breaking during World War II. And basically helped to break the German code because it was so complicated that it really took Alan's machine, Turing's machine, to break through that. And by breaking the German code, they were able to intercept and, keep their troops out of trouble and intercept in ways that were beneficial for the Allied side. But that also means with Mars and Ashlesha aspecting into the 6th house there is that he also had some pretty significant enemies himself. Let's just see here. He also has Moon and Ketu. I circled that in the 5th house. So that's in Virgo and Chitra. So you can see he's got 3 planets in Gemini and he's got 2 planets in Virgo. So he's got 5 planets in Mercury-related, Mercury-ruled constellations. So there's a lot of Mercury in this guy's constitution. So he's definitely like a rational, computing numbers guy. And so you would expect somebody like him to have strong Mercury, and he has not only Mercury in its own house, but he's got 5 planets in Mercury-related sign or ruled sign. So with Moon and Ketu and Virgo, getting back to that, Moon is the mind, like the intuitive mind or whatever, but also Ketu is like unusualness. It can be kind of distancing, kind of separative planet. So this is probably somebody who, was just visionary, would kind of sit off somewhere and just, he created all this, right, from his own intuition, his own imagination, his own, innovative mind. So you see that because, again, the 5th house also represents the mind, the intellect. So he's going to end, I believe Moon and Ketu both are in Chitra nakshatra. Chitra is the deity of that is the celestial architect. So he's somebody who's interested in structures. Yeah, so if you put this all together, he has an intuitive or innovative mind interested in unusual mental structures, which essentially what is a computer, like AI, right? Artificial intelligence, like kind of started with him. The other thing is that like this debilitated Mars aspects into the 9th house of government. And, again, he did work for the government and did a lot of good work for them. Rahu in the 11th house, aspected by Jupiter. The 11th house, besides income and socializing and things like that, I think for him, it really came down to risk-taking because he spent so much time investing his time in these machines that nobody understood or took seriously. And then he convinced somehow, these higher-ups, authorities, to fund, give him quite a bit of money. And they didn't even know what these things were. Like, it was so innovative. They were like, what am I spending all this money for? But, he got a lot of funding. He convinced people to fund, his machine building and his research and stuff like that. So, that worked well for him. But again, he's also a risk taker. He's willing to put himself out there. Besides spending all his time and mental energy on building these, colossal machines and stuff like that were, nobody else really understood, technically understood or kind of understood the significance of. And for him, his Jyestha sequence was similar actually to, I think, the last person, right? Mars, Rahu, Jupiter, Saturn. So you can see Mars, 3rd house, Rahu aspecting into the 3rd house, Jupiter aspecting into the 3rd house, Saturn aspecting. So again, another 3rd house person. So computers, communication, physics. He needed some physics to some degree. I mean, even though it wasn't technically physics, like he needed to understand physics to build this machine. So there's a lot of that. Dun, dun, dun. What's also interesting is that besides all this Mercury, besides the sort of planetary and constellation Mercury energy, Mars and Rahu are in the star of Mercury. So now you have like five planets in Mercury sign, and then you have two additional planets in Mercury star. So that's a lot of mercurial energy. And Jupiter is in Saturn star. So that's going to be even more kind of Saturnian energy. Again, he's going to be a structure guy, a bit, maybe a bit of an isolationist, because he's, and because he wants to spend all his time, making computers and things like that, and figuring out his algorithms. He was social to some extent, and I'll mention that as well. Like this Mars aspecting the sixth house, which can not only represent enemies, but also like acute injuries and diseases and stuff like that. He was gay, and he actually got arrested for some relationship he had, and he was given the choice of either going to prison or being chemically castrated. So, and again, Mars and Ashlesha, chemicals, medicines, aspecting, that energy aspecting the sixth house of acute injury, accidents, enemies, like, again, it's a pretty dark aspect of history. It used to happen, and, there's been, I think, there was Queen Elizabeth, I think, apologized and tried to rectify the treatment of people who were gay at that time. But, so he had not only those enemies, like for his sexual preferences, but also, trying to crack the code of the Germans. Those are pretty significant, significant enemies as well. So yeah, this is a chart of somebody who has Mercury in its own sign, specifically Gemini. So this is, and Mars and Ashlesha. And I think that's why I put the little blue arrow there, is that Saturn aspects 10 houses away. So actually you have Saturn aspecting into Aquarius again. So there's actually a lot of similarities with his chart and the planetary movements that are coming up in the next few weeks. So that's why I put his chart up here, so you can see how those play out. Okay, so Sun or Surya transits on June 8th. Sun enters Mrigashirsha nakshatra. So again, there's that drive. Sun represents like purpose, work, career. Is also going to Mrigashirsha. So there's going to be more of that seeking, searching energy. It's going to be conjoined with Mercury, which is going to be in Krittika initially. So again, it's that mind may waffle between being critical, nurturing, writer, speaker energy, that sort of thing. But when the Sun enters Mrigashirsha, it's still in Taurus, so there's still going to be this earthy, grounded, practical energy to it in terms of work and purpose. It might be somebody who's seeking work for very practical reasons, like they need a certain amount of money to pay certain bills and that sort of thing. More than somebody who's more aspirational in terms of, I just want to, be in a job that I love, sort of thing. So, but Sun enters Gemini Mithuna on June 15th, so then it does switch to more of that kind of mutable air, thoughts, ideas, communication. So if we're talking about careers, this could be something in education, business, or sales, but it could also be if somebody started thinking about, what are the practical things I need from work or career, and then layer on top of that, what are the sort of more philosophical ideas or things that I want from work. So maybe it starts off with like, okay, I want, $50,000 a year as a practical thing, but then it's like, I want to work with these sorts of people, or I want to work for a company that's mission is X, Y, or Z, that's more motivational, that sort of thing. And then on June 22nd, Sun enters Ardra nakshatra. So again, the nakshatra that's symbolized by a storm cloud, raindrop, teardrop. Sun represents medicine, generally, more conventional medicine, and Ardra can represent medicine as well. So Ardra can represent things like chemistry, pharmacology, homeopathy, psychology. So Ardra tends to be, more conventional medicine because of there's so much like chemical, it's such a biochemical model of paradigm of medicine versus things like Ayurveda, traditional Indian medicine. But homeopathy is included in there because you can use infinitesimal amounts of chemicals to produce homeopathic medicines, but also psychology because of that kind of, like, if you think of the teardrop, and mood, feelings, and psychology is associated with this nakshatra. So This might be somebody who's like a pioneer, somebody who's outstanding in their field. You know, they kind of somebody who's insightful but also transformative, I would say, because again, it's sort of like, you know, somebody who kind of blows in, the storm happens, and then the calm after the storm. But the storm is something that's important to sort of stir the pot, to like lift up all the you know, kind of caked on, layered on debris, to actually create fresh new paths and stuff like that. So some people might be going down that road. So here's another celebrity chart. This is Anne Frank. So it happens to be another, it's all about Taurus and Taurus and Aquarius today, seems like. So she's also Taurus, Vrishabha lagna, fixed earth sign. Lagnesha, her ruling planet's Venus. It's gone to the 12th house. Oh, by the way, this is a surya lagna. This is not an uddaya lagna. So this is a lagna sun rising chart. It's not like a Rashi constellation rising chart, so just make note of that. I have in the little notes with her birth data there. The Dasha sequence for her was Ketu Venus, which makes sense because actually you can see her Lagnesha is in the 12th house. The 12th house represents things like foreign places. It can represent things like immigration. And so she moved into her Venus Dasha planetary period when she was about 4.5 years old, and that's when I think she moved to Amsterdam, from Germany. But then the rest of her life she was in the Venus period, and that's when she basically hid in an attic with her family during the German occupation of the Netherlands. Let's see. Yeah, I think I wrote this out of order, but I'll just say it now. So August 4th, 1944 is when her family was arrested. They were actually found out, and there's controversy as to how they were found out or who might have let them, might have reported them or something like that. But a few months after that, in potentially February to April of 1945 is when she passed away in a prison camp. She was famous because she wrote a diary during this time. So she spent about 2 years in an attic with her family, hiding away because the family is Jewish. Her book is called, or her diary that was turned into a book by her father after the war, was Diary of a Young Girl. So what's interesting about this Surya Lagna chart is that you can see there's like, we have Rahu and Venus in the 12th house, which is considered a negative house. Mars, again, we have another Mars in Cancer, in Ashlesha, aspecting the 6th house. So you can tell me now, I've gone through 2 charts, you can tell me what that means. Clearly this young woman had very serious, potent enemies, right? But she had Rahu, Venus in the 12th house, Mars in the 3rd house, which is considered negative, Ketu, which is considered negative, is a malefic planet in the negative house, the 6th house, and Saturn in the 8th house. So 5 planets in negative houses, we would consider this a Balarishta yoga. So typically when there's a configuration like this, somebody has quite a bit of difficulty in childhood, and they may not actually survive childhood. So, and these are pretty, virulent, nakshatras. Like Saturn is in Mula again, what was it? Adi Dassler or Rudolph Dassler. One of the Dasslers had, again, the Saturn in Mula, which again is destruction and that sort of thing. Ketu is in, I believe, Vishaka. So Vishaka is, again, winning at all costs. And then you have the Mars and Ashlesha. So, and you can actually take the energy of Rahu, Venus aspects into that 6th house. And since Venus is the lord of the 6th house, it's going to make that house even stronger. So you're going to have some pretty virulent enemies, which was the case for this one. Let's get back to Venus Rahu, because that's kind of where she spent most of her life. Venus and Bharani. Bharani is symbolized by the womb, so there's typically energies of life and death. And Venus is art, so that's kind of what her art was about. She was a writer, and she wrote basically about her own life. I don't know if she wrote about her own death, but life and death around her of different people during that time, a very critical time. And Rahu is in Krittika, so writing. And it was an unusual part of, I think, why her book was so successful was, one, it was written by such a young person. It was well done. And it was an interesting perspective. So it was unusual that way, and I think that's probably what helped it take off and become, kind of world known. Let's see. What else? So, again, if you're looking at these things like an unusual art form about life and death, it involves the self and enemies. Oh, okay. So why did I write that? So it involves the self because the first house is ruled by Venus. The first house represents the self, and the sixth house of enemies. So that's essentially what her book was about. Mars and Ashlesha I mentioned, Ketu and Vishaka I mentioned. With Venus, again, that's going to make the sixth house very strong, powerful, unpredictable, explosive, but victorious, unfortunately, in some ways, enemies. So if we look at this first house is pretty, stellar in a lot of ways. So Jupiter is in Krittika, so again, more of that potential, because Jupiter is about publishing and speaking and writing, as is Mercury. And both of these planets have Digbala, or directional strength, with Sun, which represents purpose and career. You see it all here. She was meant to be a writer. And Sun and Mercury were in Mrigashirsha. So, again, that's seeking, searching energy. And I think that's part of why that diary probably not only was something for her to focus on, and give her something to do while she's like up in the attic for 2 years or whatever, but she was thoughtful. She was seeking and searching answers. As a young woman, she died when she was 15, so she was like 13. Just imagine, you have to kind of put yourself in those, her shoes, right? There's no computers and cell phones, internet or whatever. You just have a pen and some paper, a notebook. And she spent her time writing and analyzing the people around her, the situation around her, the larger forces at work. Like, some of it was very psychological, some of it was very social. There was a lot of thought, and energy that was put into that. And it probably helped her to find meaning or purpose in that very unusual, strange, and constrained situation. So, Jupiter and Mercury, I mentioned, have Digbala, so they have strength there. And again, those two planets, it's all about writing, publishing, communicating, teaching, again, mixed in with that Mrigashirsha energy of meaning and purpose. Then we also have, I have this like purple circle in the 10th house that has nothing in it. So that's the thing too, is, when you're looking at charts, like, it's easy for the eye to get focused on, like most people probably would focus on this like lovely Jupiter, Mercury, Sun combination here. But actually the 10th house, even though it doesn't visually have any planets in it, the planets of 4 different planets, the energy of 4 different planets is aspected into there. So you have the moon aspecting in there. The moon represents public, emotions, the mind, psychology. You have Mars, aspecting into there. So siblings, she did write about, she had a sister, enemies, disturbances, that sort of thing. Ketu aspects into there. You can take that because Venus, its dispositor, is aspecting it, so you can take Ketu 5 and 9 houses away. So Ketu, all this sort of like chaotic, disruptive, isolationist, separatist energy, that's there. And what else? Saturn. So death, literally the planet of death in a nakshatra that represents death, like all of that hardcore stuff was basically what she wrote about. And that was basically her career, even though she was young. Because again, her career was fantastic, even though her career was mostly posthumous in nature. And that's essentially what she wrote about, even as a young woman. Death, destruction, how do you make sense of it? What's the psychology of it, for herself and others? Yeah, and that's what she became famous for. The 10th house is also one of the houses indicates fame. I wrote on here also Mars and Ashlesha aspects Aquarius and Capricorn. So she's another person who has this Mars-Saturn combination, right? And you can tell me now, right? Athletes, engineers, perseverance, workaholic. But especially with, I think all these negative planets in the 10th house, because Saturn was disruptive, although there's some strength there. And Mars aspecting, because Mars is actually exalted in Capricorn, which is her 9th house. She may have actually, if she'd lived longer, she might have ended up working for the government. Although you can also see this as somebody who is anti-government, or at least anti-authoritative, maybe not the Netherlands, government, but the presiding authorities, right, the German authorities when they occupied that city. But yeah, you can see when you put this all together, it's all about the psychology, philosophy, because this is Aquarius, this is all about ideas of psychology and philosophy of enemies, death, isolation. That's all there. So that's Anne Frank. Then we have the slow-moving planets. So what's kind of funny, ironically, is that at least what I was taught was that it's really the slow-moving planets, which are Saturn, Jupiter, and Ketu, Rahu, Ketu, that are the real movers and shakers when it comes to transits, but they move so slowly. I don't know. I find that actually even these little dips and things like that, of moving into different nakshatras really can change things a lot. So that's what I tend to look at. But I guess classically, it's more Saturn, Jupiter, and Ketu transit, Rahu, Ketu transits that are considered important, quote unquote. So there are actually a few transits or changes with those planets. So on June 17th, Saturn goes retrograde, or Vakri, and it's going to be retrograde until November 4th. So Saturn is already in its own sign; it's already strong, and then when it goes retrograde, it gains even more strength. The thing is that it's, again, it's an Aquarius or Kumbha, it's an air sign, so there's going to be like a lot of ideas. This could also, again, indicate a lot of anxiety, because Saturn is a windy Vata planet and Aquarius is an air sign. So there's going to be, also because it's retrograde, there can be this energy of like reviewing or redoing things. The thing though too is that Saturn is going to be in Shatabhisha until the 15th of October. And as I mentioned a few times, Shatabhisha is translates as 100 healers. So especially because Saturn is a malefic planet, this can indicate diseases that are very difficult to resolve. It's going to move out of Shatabhisha on October 15th, but it's going to come back when Saturn goes direct again from November 23rd to April 6th. So the reason why I'm going down this rabbit hole, because, again, this is supposed to be a monthly transit video, but when I started looking kind of at where Saturn's headed even over the next year, I thought I'd just mention it now and give you a heads up, because it looks like there may really be quite a bit of difficulty for some people. So not everybody. For some people, this is going to be an amazing period, but I think it's not without effort. Yeah, let's put it that way. Because again, Saturn is going to be so strong in this, because Saturn's malefic, it's going to bring out the more negative qualities of Shatabhisha. So that being said, this may mean that somebody has a relapse or recurrence of a medical issue. So you might think, oh, okay, I'm done with that. Let's move on with life. But no, it might be, back to the drawing board. And because, again, Saturn is a Vata planet, and it's in an air sign, there could be a lot of anxiety created from this. Now, again, don't freak out. The deliverance of the karmas associated with this for each individual is going to be different. So it depends on what dasha, what planetary period you're running. It can also depend on if Saturn is what we would call a chidra graha, or a graha that's it's a piercing graha. It's a graha that indicates can indicate weakness or vulnerability. It also depends on what house or bhava that Saturn is in for you, and it also depends on sub-zodiac analysis. So if we're talking medical stuff, things like the D6, D8, D27, we want to look at that. So, if all those things, if you're not running Saturn, if Saturn's not a Chidra Graha, if it's in a positive house, if it's looking good in the sub-zodiacs, then, this might actually be a great thing for you. But for some people, it's going to be pretty tough. So, the other thing is that all these, Saturn is currently aspecting Rahu and Aries or Ashwini. It's also aspecting Leo, Simha, and Scorpio, Vrishika. So those 4 signs are going to, if any of those signs, are negative in your chart, what we would call negative signs like 3, 6, 8, 12, then you might see more of the negative aspects of this. Currently, this Saturn is being, it's already aspected by a debilitated Mars, and then when the Mars moves into Ashlesha, and Simha, Mars is going to be on that Saturn, so it's going to bring like a Martian energy. So there's going to be like inflammation or flare-ups or like twists and turns potentially, and again like medication potentially. And that, so Mars is going to aspect this Saturn until August 18th. So, next, almost most of the summer. So, that's the first, so besides Saturn aspecting Rahu, and that's going to be true until the end of October. So that's one thing. And then Mars is going to parade by, and then Mercury is going to parade by when it goes through Leo from July 24th through September 30th. So that might indicate things like peripheral nerves and anxiety, additionally to what Saturn also already indicates. Then, and then the Sun is going to, parade on by when it goes through Leo, and it's going to be Swa, so it's going to be strong. So again, more inflammation, because it's a fiery planet. Sun also represents things like general health and the central nervous system. So, again, these planets are representing, 2 planets representing inflammation, all 3 planets representing different aspects of the nervous system. You kind of see where this might be going. Then Venus is going to parade on by October 1st through November 2nd. So this might be because Venus represents spouse, partner, whatever. This could represent the toll that this whole situation has on your partner. There might be some difficulties, especially if they're caretaking of you or something like that, or helping you out. It could really start to kind of take a toll on them. And then there's going to be a party of Vartana exchange of houses between Sun and Venus starting October 17th. So it's almost like, you get the sun back, and more inflammation again. So it's gonna be, and then to add to all this, there are going to be eclipses on October 14th and October 28th. So there's also going to be a connection with the Rahu and Ketu, because Saturn is aspecting Rahu through all this. So what we're potentially looking at is a bit of a marathon that's also a roller coaster. So with this much Vata going on, it means for those of you who this might be kind of a tough road ahead the next few months or so, you really want to pace yourself, balance and ground your vata, so your wind energy. So routines, daily routines, warm, moist, nourishing food, whole foods, meditation, walks in nature, let go of anything you don't actually need to do, get back to basics, don't overdo, don't push, just really take it in stride as much as you can. Okay, so anyway, I just, again, even though this is a monthly transit video, just when I saw how that might be playing out, some of you I wanted to give a heads up. So June 21st, moving on to Jupiter, that's going to be entering Bharani. This is in Aries or Mesha. It's a friend or friendly sign for Jupiter. It's a fire sign. And Bharani is symbolized by the womb. Jupiter can represent things like a child. So some of you might be, and this is funny because it's happening on the summer solstice. So there's sort of like potentially a birth. There's literally, for some of you, there's going to be a birth of a child. Especially if maybe Aries is, Aries is your first or fifth house, because fifth house represents children, potentially, or Jupiter's aspecting into your fifth house. It could be a birth of a child. But you have to consider this whole thing that I went through with Saturn right up above, because Jupiter's with Rahu, and Saturn, Rahu always creates twists and turns and hidden things. It's definitely not a straightforward path. And then Saturn or Shani is aspecting. So you're going to have a very strong Shani, Saturn, that's aspecting this. So, and also, why did I write Mars October 3rd? I'm not sure. I'll have to try to remember why I wrote that down. Mars, October 3rd. What's going on October 3rd? Oh, it may be that, I don't know. I'll have to check on that. So I don't know why I wrote that. I'll have to try to remember. But anyway, so many moving parts. It's astrology. So 26th of June, Ketu enters Chitra nakshatra. And this is the last nakshatra shift for Rahu Ketu before they completely shift signs at the end of October. So Ketu is currently in Libra or Tula. It's an air sign. And I think I mentioned already, Chitra is symbolized, the deity, I mentioned the deity of Chitra is the celestial architect, but the symbol of it is a gemstone, which again is that, multifaceted structural thing. So especially because it's in Tula, you can have somebody who's maybe interested in architecture, but especially mental constructs. So this is more like kind of the design aspects, especially if Venus or Moon is involved, because there's intuition, imagination, the artistic flair. But because Ketu's there, it could be like an unusual structure, an innovative structure, or even the destruction of a structure. So there's going to be a twist there with Ketu. And again, Ketu is going to be, changing things up before it, kind of moves on out and delivers its last bit of karma for the Libra, being in its position in Libra, until the next year and a half when it's going to be in Virgo. So those are the slow-moving planets in June. All right, and one more chart to kind of finish up and I think bring this all together, hopefully. But this is a celebrity chart for Anna Mae Bullock. And if you don't know her by her stage name, this is Tina Turner, who recently passed away. So you can see here her rising sign is Cancer. It happens to be in Ashlesha, which we've talked about in almost every chart. She has Rahu and Ketu in Aries and Libra. They're swapped, but they are like the current sky pattern. Saturn is with Ketu, so it's that it's almost like that Saturn aspecting Rahu. Saturn's debilitated in Aries, so Saturn's going to deliver some negative karma probably. There's also a parivartana exchange of houses between Saturn and Mars. So you not only have Saturn on Ketu, but you have Mars on Ketu, or you have Saturn and Mars on both Rahu and Ketu. So that's going to be a pretty tough bit of energy to process, work through, live through. But anyway, what other things are sort of similar? So there's some similarities to her chart and the current sky pattern. So let's go through, start at the top. So she's a Cancer lagna, Karka lagna, and her ascendant is an Ashlesha. Cancer is a water sign. It's also a Chara Rashi or an active Rashi. So she's going to be a mover and shaker. She's going to be an emotional person. So just that already is telling us this is going to be an emotional person. They're usually highly intelligent, but you got to check, intellect and stuff like that in other ways. But Ashlesha, mesmerizing, sexy, active, which she was. She had energy in spades. Then the Lagnesha, which is Moon, the ruler of Cancer, it went to the 11th house, like Adi Dassler and Rudy Dassler, at least from their Chandra Lagna perspective. The 11th house is, again, income. It's clubs, group societies. It's risk-taking. It's a Kamastana. So it's a house of, having fun, really, enjoying oneself. So what that means for her, and the moon is in Rohini, so that very lovely, attractive energy, and the moon is there. So this is somebody, and she does have a very lovely face. She's going to be a risk taker. She's going to have the capacity to earn a lot of money through art, potentially artistic type things, which is what she did. And her imagination, her intuition are going to be on high. So the moon is exalted in Taurus. So, and this is her mind. So she has a lovely, beautiful, attractive, artistic mind. I mentioned the exchange of houses between Mars and Saturn already. But again, it's kind of like what I mentioned with which chart? Rudolph Dassler's chart. With the exchange of Saturn and Mars, that means Saturn, the debilitated Saturn, depending on which flip you do, if you flip them or not. Basically, Mars, when you flip them, Mars is going to be on 8 houses in the chart, and Saturn is going to be on 7 houses. So almost all the chart is affected by, influenced by Saturn and Mars. So that's going to be pretty tough. Let's see, the lagna and the 5th house are aspected by Jupiter. And when you do the exchange of houses, they're also aspected by Mars. So when you get Mars and Jupiter together, Jupiter is like oration, Mars is kind of fire, passion, that sort of thing. And especially because Mars is in the 8th house, sometimes we call the 8th house the house of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, frankly, which is, she had a lot of in her life. And it can be like enthusiasm, one. So because they're both in the lagna, she's going to be a really enthusiastic person, a lot of energy, but also using her voice in very, almost aggressive ways. Sometimes it can indicate a lawyer, but I've also seen, like last month I did Celine Dion's chart, and she's actually a Cancer rising, and she has Jupiter and Mars aspecting her lagna as well, and she can belt it out. So this is somebody who's going to be like a powerhouse singer. It's not somebody who's just like, I don't know, playing a harp or a guitar in a cafe or something barefoot. That's not her. She's going to have a lot of fire and passion and drive and activity, and it's going to be a show. It's going to be a real show. So let's see. So again, this exchange of houses between Mars and Saturn, it strengthens the 8th house and the 10th house, but it also makes the whole chart more chaotic. Especially with Saturn being debilitated, it makes it even more kind of explosive. Being on Ketu and Rahu, both of these, that's going to be pretty tough. And actually, I wrote in her bio that, because the fourth house represents mother, and then the mother's partner is going to be the house opposite to it. And her mother apparently, had an abusive marriage and ran away, and actually came back when she found out she was pregnant or something with one of her kids. So, a lot of Tina Turner's story of how she was with Ike Turner, who was very abusive, cocaine addict, bipolar. It was interesting to me that her mother kind of had the same story. And so when I was looking at this chart, it kind of made me feel, I can't verify, but kind of made me feel that it's almost like this is sort of inherited karma or family karma or something like that as part of what Tina Turner worked through in her life. Because she was in that marriage for a long time before she finally left and got out of that. But yeah, she had a lot of ups and downs. But it just, I don't know, my mind kind of went to that. She was born into Sati Sati. The Saturn is in the constellation before the moon. And she had a lot of ups, downs, and sideways things going on in her childhood. Lived with grandma, got sent back. Was, I think, going back and forth between Tennessee and St. Louis or something like that. Anyway, it was kind of up and down for her as a kid early on. The other thing is that Saturn, this debilitated Saturn that's retrograde, so it's got strength, but it's debilitated, with Ketu, explosive. And then, again, flip it into this 8th house then, where it's Swa. So it's a pretty virulent Saturn. That Saturn is lord of the 7th house, which is a spouse. So, that's essentially Ike Turner right there. And then also, like, typically when we start to assess the spouse, and again, this is just the first spouse. We only look at the first spouse typically with the 7th house. We also look at Venus, because Venus is the planet that represents spouse. Venus is in a negative sign, the 6th house of enemies. You guys should know that by now, like 6th house enemies. And Venus is in Mula. So again, Mula nakshatra, like destruction, dissolving underground. So you've got this, but he's got some power because Saturn aspects into the 7th house from the 10th house. So even though this person was very destructive, they were powerful and destructive. So that's a pretty serious enemy to have, which is essentially what he was for her. Also the Saturn aspecting in the 7th house from the 10th house also not only gives strength to the spouse, but also independent business. So that helped her in her career, to some extent, although, she definitely had ups and downs in her career, but that's like, that's the Ketu, Rahu, Mars thing going on too. What else? Oh, she does have a Hamsa Yoga, so that's Jupiter in its own sign and a Kendra Trikona. So that brings in grace. It happens to be in the 9th house of spirituality, and Jupiter is the planet representing spirituality. And what was interesting was when she entered her Jupiter period, because her Jyestha sequence was Moon, Mars, Rahu, Jupiter. Aren't they all the same? No, they're Mars, Rahu, Jupiter. I guess all of them. They don't know start with Moon. But that's, I think, when she started chanting mantras. And that was also interesting to me because when I was looking up, I don't know if I wrote the date down here, but I think it was like July 1st, 1976, maybe? Don't quote me on that. I think that's when she finally, like, had it with Ike Turner and left with, like, I think the story was 36 cents in her pocket or something like that. She just left everything behind. It was funny because when I was looking, I didn't put up all her sub-zodiacs and stuff like that, but when I was looking at them, I was sort of expecting a lot of negative placements and stuff like that. And actually, there was a lot of positive placements. So it was sort of like, what I got from that was it's almost like, her spirituality, her chanting, her goodness, because she does have like a sweet, beautiful mind. It's almost like that Jupiter period was healing for her rather than destructive, even though it seemed like destructive, like, oh, like she lost everything, and I think she only kept her stage name so she could keep making a living off of it, and like a couple cars or something like that. But otherwise he got everything, Ike Turner got everything else. But it's like, she got her freedom, and she healed, because in order to finally walk away from that kind of deeply entrenched, destructive, toxic relationship, something within her needed to heal, and she had, somehow developed enough positive karma to shift out of that situation. And so actually there were a lot of positive things, and she was in her Jupiter period, and you can see Jupiter is lovely and strong here. So, yeah, that was interesting. So, and then all these eras, okay, so the fifth house, though, this woman, so some of the other charts were like third house people. She is I would say eighth house, but especially a fifth house person. So you have Sun and Mercury in the fifth house, and I circled it, but you have 4 other planets aspecting in here as well. You have the moon, you have Mars when you do the Parivartana, you have Saturn when you do the Parivartana, and you have Jupiter. So there's a lot of energy in the fifth house. The fifth house it's the natural in the zodiac. Natural zodiac is ruled by Leo, which is ruled by the sun. So it's kind of a showy, like vibrant type constellation. It's typically associated with the stage, and she was all about the stage, like not only singing but acting, dancing, all that kind of stuff. So she had the moon, in Rohini. She had, and the thing is, she has Sun and Mercury both in Anuradha, which I'd mentioned in Adi Dassler's chart. So she's a bridge builder. People loved her. A lot of support from the public. People loved her. That all came into play. So moon, public loved her. Active, Mars, Saturn, athletic. Yes, yes, check. Jupiter, vibrant. And again, the fifth house is also not only the stage, but it's also writing. And it's also chanting mantras, which she did all of these things. And especially with the moon, Mercury, Jupiter, Sun, that type of thing. And she was prolific, so that's that kind of athletic, Saturn, Mars, not just physically athletic, but mentally, emotionally, I think, athletic, to withstand all the things she went through in her life. But when you have moon, Mercury, Jupiter, again, communications in all sorts of ways, it's like that songwriting, intuition, creativity. Yeah, it's all there. Let's see. Well, let's see. Why did I write these things? There's so much, and then I'm like, why did I write these things? So, and Rahu is in a star of Mars. I'm not sure why I got into that. I'm just checking. I'm not sure why I got into that. Mars in 12th house, the D9. Oh, okay. Yeah, I think. I'm not sure why I wrote Rahu in the star of Mars. It is, but I'm not sure why I wrote it. I don't remember why. But I did also write Mars in the 12th bhava, or 12th house of the D9. So the D9 is a sub-zodiac that we look at to look at spouse. And she got involved with Ike Turner in her Mars. Oh, that's why I wrote Rahu and Mars, star of Mars. Okay, it's kind of backward. So, so she got involved with Ike Turner, and her profession, during her Mars period. And again, Mars is in the 8th house of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But the thing is, Rahu is in Mars' sign. Rahu is in Mars' star. And so what that means is that when Rahu is active in its planetary period, it also means that the star that it's in, which is also Mars, is still active. So what that means is that she not only went through Mars, her Mars period as a Mars period, but actually her Rahu, which is a much longer period. I think it's, so between the two of them, like 30 years, I think, almost. She was basically running Mars. So this little Mars in Shatabhisha, again, you know that by now, right? Difficult to cure diseases. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll, like she was basically an 8th house person who basically turned that into her career in a way, or it definitely was part of her career. There was a link there. So yeah, and again, with Mars being in the 12th house of the D9, so D9 being the subzodiac of the spouse or partner, and the 12th house is the house of loss and expenses. So clearly, all of this drugs, drug, sex, and rock and roll with her, with people around her, cost her a lot. You know, it was a big drain on her. So this Mars in the 8th house, also in Shatabhisha, the Mars. If you checked out my symbolism of Mars video, you know that medically Mars represents things like the urinary system, like kidney, bladders, and stuff like that. And the 8th house represents chronic disease. And in her later years, she developed kidney disease and needed a kidney transplant, which her second husband donated to her. So again, that was also like, when I heard that part of the story, her story, I was like, wow, somehow she went from Ike Turner, who was just, wow, full tilt off the hook, unpredictable, violent, you know, abusive, to this man who was very supportive and generous and literally gave, you know, his life to save her life. So just the, you know, spiritual trajectory of this woman, and I think to some extent it talks about the power of spirituality and mantras and things like that to change your trajectory in life. You know, that's part of why as Jyotishis, we often give people mantras to chant to help them ameliorate past negative karmas, to open up the road to better experiences and that sort of thing. So, inspiring woman, inspiring life, interesting astrology, and, you know, we wish her all the best now that she's not on our plane anymore, but wherever she is, we wish her well and thank her for her service, you know, as the queen of rock and roll and all the records she sold around the world. And she's a pretty amazing person, besides being an amazing artist. Okay, so we've talked about so much today. So most people are interested in their own charts. If you are, you know, we talked a lot about Cancer today with Venus and Mars. We talked about Gemini because of Sun and Mercury. We talked about Aquarius because of Saturn. So if any of those storylines with those planets is interesting to you, you probably want to find out where these signs are in your chart. And so then what you can do is, like, if you know that Gemini is in your 7th house, you can look up here. The 7th house, or bhava, represents spouse, partnership, independent business. So, you know, with Sun and Gemini moving into, Sun and Mercury moving into Gemini, if that was your 7th bhava, most likely that means you or your partner are interested or searching for, thinking about probably going into independent business, for example. So you can start to kind of see what aspects of your chart and life link up with where these constellations or rashis are. So I've listed them. You know, there's the 1-7 axis, the 2-8 axis, the 3-9 axis on this page, or this chart, this slide, and then the next slide continues to 4-10 axis, the 5-11 axis, and the 6-12 axis. So, you know, again, take it all with a grain of salt. Don't freak yourself out, because there are other things there are a lot of different things to kind of, as you can see, even with the charts that I've talked about today, I'm really just scratching the surface. So don't freak yourself out. You know, just keep learning more about astrology. And, you know, it can take months, years to really... you know, it's like you find it, you know, you think you know a chart, and then you learn more, and they're like, oh, I didn't see this before, or I didn't really make this connection before. And you get more and more layers of depth with charts as you learn more astrology. So if you're into it. All right, so that's it for today. As I mentioned, I have teaching videos on astrology in my concepts playlist if you're interested. I also do individual birth chart readings on Zoom. If that's of interest, you can email heartlightastro@yahoo.com. I do have another YouTube channel on natural medicine, including other Vedic arts like Ayurveda and yoga, as well as homeopathy and naturopathic medicine. That's called Nature Source Care. So as always, I hope that, this video is interesting, maybe even enlightening. That would be great. But helpful to you in just kind of understanding it's not that the planets cause, these things to happen. They're just sort of symbols that represent how the energies, our own karmas, play out. So it's really just, it's almost like reading the news, but instead of reading, the Wall Street Journal or New York Times, it's like you're reading the sky to kind of know what's going on and what's at play. So I hope that it just helps you navigate these cycles as we move through them. All right, so thank you for your time as always, and until the next one, take care. Namaste.